All right. Based on the essays you guys did about turning points for women's rights, it seems like there's a little bit of confusion about the idea of birth control, and particularly the idea of the pill, versus Roe v. Wade. And so I wanted to do a little video just explaining the differences between the two so that you have a better sense of what's going on. Now, as you may remember, up until, sort of from the 1870s up to the 1920s, it is very, very difficult to access birth control. And by birth control at this point, we basically mean condoms, because it's the sort of most reliable form of birth control out there during that time period. But it's very difficult to access this birth control in the U.S. because of something called the Comstock Laws. And remember that the Comstock Laws say that sending information about contraception through the mail is basically equivalent to sending pornography through the mail. So it's illegal, just as sending pornography would be. And this is going to cause particularly lower class women to have a very, very difficult time in actually accessing birth control because they simply don't have the resources to get a hold of it. While sort of the most educated women and the wealthiest women tend to be able to sort of find a way to get access to birth control despite the technical restrictions on getting a hold of it. And this is where Margaret Sanger, remember my favorite person, comes into play. Because Margaret Sanger goes on a mission to get women access to birth control. So in the 19-teens and the 1920s, she gets thrown into jail pretty frequently because she insists on continuing to send information about birth control through the mail. She's advertising in magazines saying, if you want to know how to limit family size, write to this place. We will send you information, and we will send you the methods. So that she's actually sending birth control through the mail. And this gets her in trouble with the police and other law enforcement agencies quite frequently because she is actually directly contravening the Comstock Laws. But she refuses to give up, and she continues to send this information through the mail. And eventually, by the end of the 1920s, the government has more or less given up on actually making this a big problem. So by the end of the 1920s, she's actually got the support of J.D. Rockefeller, a very prominent businessman, and actually a senator from New York, who agrees that actually it is quite good for women, particularly lower class women, to have information about how to limit family size. And so by the end of the 1920s, she has actually made a difference, and she makes it easier for women, in some states at least, to get access to information about birth control. But Margaret Sanger doesn't want to stop there. And she's still a relatively young woman in the 1920s and 1930s. And therefore, by the 1950s, she's beginning to look for new methods of birth control. And we're going to take a look at that in just a second. So this, as you can tell, the picture is of sort of an early birth control pill package. And it's essentially telling you where you begin and where you end your monthly cycle of taking the pill. But Margaret Sanger actually proves to be quite instrumental in getting the birth control pill available. So she's not a scientist, but she does know, and she sort of works out, that scientists have realized that women's menstrual cycles and women's fertility is regulated by hormones. And so she begins to work with this doctor named Pincus, who's an endocrinologist, which basically means he studies hormones. And in 1951, she convinces him to begin to study the effects of hormones on a woman's fertility cycle. And it becomes quickly recognized that what's actually going on is that the hormone progesterone is actually responsible for the fertility cycle that women experience. Okay. So pretty quickly, they figure out what they're looking for and what hormone they would need to alter in order to actually use hormones to regulate birth, okay, and to regulate a woman's fertility. And this actually, in terms of medicines, this actually develops quite quickly. By 1954, Pincus and Sanger have actually started the first human trial. It's a fairly small trial. It's 50 women, and it's in the state of Massachusetts. But it turns out that the birth control pill that they've developed works very, very well. And so by 1956, they were ready to start a large-scale trial. But the problem here is that for a large-scale trial, you might run into some problems with states not liking the trial of birth control on women. So they decide to actually do the trial in Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. dominion. It belongs to the U.S., but it's not a state. And it also doesn't have any birth control laws on its books. So they take the pill down to Puerto Rico, and they do a large-scale trial. And it becomes very, very quickly obvious that this pill that they've developed, this progesterone-based hormonal pill, is very effective at limiting pregnancy. In fact, it's basically 100% effective if it's used as prescribed. So that's great. Now, unfortunately, what isn't great is that it becomes clear later that they also recognize that the pill had some certain some certain side effects, that it caused an increased risk of blood clots and an increased risk of certain ovarian cancers, which is not good, obviously. But at the moment, people did not realize that, because this is something that basically the doctors who are doing the trial hid from people. And people just sort of realized, okay, well, this pill has actually worked incredibly effectively at limiting women's ability to get pregnant. And it's exactly what they want to happen, okay? So in 1957, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is responsible for regulating any sort of medicine in the U.S., first says that the pill can be used for treatment of women with menstrual disorders. And the idea here is that, as you can tell, this is not yet actually being marketed as a contraceptive. It's not being marketed as a way to prevent pregnancy. It's being marketed as a way to regulate the menstrual cycle of women who might either have just terrible cramps associated with menstruation, or who might have, too many menstrual cycles, so that it's not coming at every 28 days, it's coming much more frequently, or anything like that. So at this point, it's just prescribed to regulate menstruation. But of course, doctors, and very quickly women, realize that it's not just for menstruation, and that it can actually be used as birth control. And so you see this enormous uptick in the number of women who are reporting menstrual complaints in 1958. And by 1960, the FDA has actually made this pill available specifically for contraception. So it's actually marketed and able to be used on the market for birth control, okay, to prevent pregnancy. And the popularity of the pill, just goes through the roof very, very rapidly. I think in 1962, there were 1.2 million women using it. By 1963, it's 2.3 million. And by 1965, it's 6.5 million women using hormonal birth control pills to regulate their fertility. That's an enormous number, okay? And it is really, really telling about a shift that is happening in the U.S. around the time of the pill. And basically because of the pill, which is the shift towards attitudes about women having sex. And we're going to take a look at the next slide, which will explain that a little bit more. So because women are now able to regulate their fertility, they're able to say when they want to have children or when they don't want to have children, you start to get a lot more freedom for women. So you get groups like Planned Parenthood, which you can see is sort of on this sign right here, which actually provides information about the pill and provides access to the pill for women, particularly low-income women, who want help in deciding how many children to have, or want help in limiting their fertility, limiting the amount of children you have. So you have suddenly a great amount of access to birth control and to family planning and to decisions about your fertility. You've got organizations popping up that are meant to help women get access to those things, even women who sort of are not of the upper class. So even women who have typically struggled to get access to family planning are now able to get better access to it. And again, as I think you already know, it tends to be something that's quite useful for women because, unlike a condom, which you have to sort of get your husband to agree to use or your partner to agree to use, birth control pills are something that a woman can decide to take, and it limits her fertility without any sort of bigger input from the man she's partnered with. And as you can see, that also sort of leads to a bit more of a free and easy attitudes towards sexuality. So you've got this image of Annette Funicello, who you may or may not know is a very sort of famous, and she was very much seen as a very wholesome sort of teen idol in the 1950s and the 1960s and the early 1970s. And you've sort of got her actually starring in this advertisement for birth control, and it's sort of giving this idea of a free and easy relationship with men. And the fact that you've got this very, very wholesome and charming teen idol actually appearing on messages for the birth control pill sort of does give you a real indication that there's now a shift in American society's attitudes towards sex and sexuality. Not immediate for everybody, and certainly not everywhere at sort of the same pace, but you are getting this sort of sense that sex is more natural, sex can happen outside of marriage, and this goes along with what's happening in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s as sexual attitudes are changing in general. The pill plays a big role in that because now sexual attitudes are sort of easier to change because you don't have the possibility of resultant accident or mistake or pregnancy coming out of your liaison with the man. So you've got this sort of protection, and that's beginning to be seen as very, very important for women, and it allows them to, first of all, have a freer and easier attitude towards sex before marriage, and then of course also in marriage it allows them to decide how many children they're going to have, when they're going to have them, and it gives them the ability to space out those pregnancies so that they're able to achieve career goals, personal goals, and things like that they want without necessarily having a pregnancy interrupt that. Now, Roe v. Wade, though, is something different. Okay, Roe v. Wade is a Supreme Court case that particularly states that women should have access to abortion. An abortion is the termination of a pregnancy that has already begun. So this is in some ways the sort of corollary to access to birth control. Okay, so in the 1960s, you see women getting access to a birth control pill that makes it very easy for them to prevent pregnancy. In the 1970s, you see the corollary to that in the creation of Roe v. Wade and the decision of the Supreme Court that Roe v. Wade means that women should have access to safe and legal abortions. In other words, that women should have the ability to terminate pregnancy. Okay? And I think this is the key difference. Don't say that Roe v. Wade gives women the ability to prevent pregnancy or gives women sort of access to contraception. Access to contraception happens before Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is specifically about ending pregnancy, not preventing it. And so women are obviously going to look at Roe v. Wade as a sort of a last resort. If you are pregnant and you know you need to end the pregnancy, the decision of Roe v. Wade is going to be very important. And it is extremely important in terms of women's rights because it validates women's autonomy over their own bodies. In other words, it says that women should have the choice in deciding how their bodies are treated and what happens to their body. And this is sort of the last chink in pushing away the laws that had come about in the 1800s that said that women couldn't have access to birth control and basically denied them access to the ability to control their own reproductive destiny. That sort of gets chipped away slowly in the 1920s with Margaret Sanger getting women access to birth control. In the 1960s with better access to birth control in a hormonal way, so an easier access to a safe and very, very effective form of birth control that a woman can control. 1973 is sort of the last bit of that, and it's about saying that women should have autonomy over their body, even if they are pregnant. So even if they have another life in there, they should still have autonomy and the ability to end a pregnancy because it is their body. But it's not in and of itself changing all that much about women's access to birth control. That's actually already happened about 10 years before, and you could even say maybe 40 years before, with Margaret Sanger getting women access to condoms and getting women information about birth control. It continues in the 1960s by making birth control something safe, effective, that women can take themselves, and that they sort of now have the ability to very easily control their own reproduction. Okay, and Roe v. Wade is basically about the last step in that, and saying that women, if they do find themselves pregnant, do have the right to terminate the pregnancy. And as you can imagine, and as you already know, this continues to be a really contentious and hot topic question in the U.S. When should women be able to terminate pregnancies? At what point does the pregnancy constitute a viable life form? At what point should abortion no longer be allowed? And so, as you can see, even just in this image over here, you've got people who say stop abortion now, right next to people who are saying keeping abortion legal. It continues to be very much a question about sort of at what point life begins. But the key takeaway from this is don't conflate the pill and Roe v. Wade. They are two different things. Yes, they are linked in the sense that they are both about women's access to reproductive freedom. But I would say actually the pill in some ways is actually probably more important for more women because it is, it gives them the ability to prevent pregnancy, which is what most people are going to want to do anyway, rather than ending a pregnancy. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope that clears things up. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And of course, as always, you should also feel free to email me with your essay plans, essay outlines, etc.